it's really a privilege to be able to give this talk within the context of the LIFELANGS project. Essentially, I'll be telling two stories about the interface of language, racism, and education. The first story I'll be sharing will be what other people have been doing in this area. And the second part of the story will be what I have tried to do, building on what others have done. So, two short stories, hopefully. So, in terms of the outline for my talk, I'll start off by offering a certain view of the construct of race, and I'll find some evidence for just how appropriate I think that construct is. And the evidence I'll be providing will come from two sources: from the academic biography of a colleague, but also from Enlightenment philosophers. Thereafter, I'll attempt to give some insights into work, into scholarship that has been done on the interface of language, racism in the educational context. And I call this section Racializing Acts in Language in Education. So how is race performed, enacted in language in the context of education? And thereafter, I'll introduce my story. What is the niche that I think I see in the existing body of work? And what is it that I'm doing to attempt to occupy that niche, to do something about that gap that I think I may have spotted? And then I'll conclude with some suggestions as to what we can do as teachers, as scholars, as community organizers to identify racism in educational materials, and what we can also do to push back on our observations. So in a nutshell then, that's what I propose for this talk. Okay, so let's start with the notion of racism. There are probably 1,001 accounts of what racism entails and what the race construct means. But for these purposes, I'd like to suggest that we see racism as being founded based on three asymmetries, three hierarchies. The first has to do with power. So racism is a power relationship. You've got to have the power to be able to discriminate against some other person. So there's a power dimension. But there's also the being dimension, all right? If you like, the body shaming dimension, all right? And then there is the knowledge dimension. Now, these three dimensions, I suggest, do not work in silos. They are mutually reinforcing, all right? So the knowledge reinforces the power reinforces the being, and so on. So they don't work in silos. We need to see them as interconnected. So that's going to be the construct of race and racism I'll be working with in this presentation. Now, of course, the construct of race and racism has evolved over time. And here, Sanjuhira gives us three phases, what he calls three phases of racism in, well, let's say in Western history. The first he refers to as theological racism. And by that he means that in the time period referred to here, many societies were theocratic in nature. So there was no separation of state and religion, all right? People were imprisoned for life for holding certain views. Some were burnt to death. Theologians possessed the knowledge, and you were considered human, fully human, on the basis of your proximity or how close you were to a given faith. So the further you were away from the dominant faith, the more likely you were considered subhuman, all right? Such derogatory terms as infidel race, heathen race, and so on and so forth. Now, the period, however, that we often talk about is what he describes as the era of biological racism, where it's about phenotypical features. Your appearance is the basis for discriminating against certain groups, is the basis for the hierarchy, all right? And of course, pseudoscience, pseudobiology provided the knowledge base for that. So cranial measurements were done, you know, people's noses and lips and all of that measured, and this was also expected or claimed to be indicative of how intelligent they were. So often when we talk about racism, we often look at this second phase. But there is a third phase, he argues, where biological racism, of course, is no longer politically correct. In many societies, in Germany, for instance, you are not allowed to use race in public discourse. In Scandinavia, there are lots of colleagues here from Sweden or who've been in Sweden. So you don't use those terms any longer. But is that to say that just because you don't use the term race or racism, that practice is gone? Perhaps not. There are surrogates, there are proxies that have emerged, all right? And here, it's all about your location, your geolocation in the world. So nationality becomes very important. In Wallenstein's world systems theory, the claim is that the closer you are to a center of power, the more sort of human you are, and the further away you are from the center of power, the less powerful and therefore less human and so on that you are. So cultural racism has become a surrogate, a proxy, as it were, for biological racism. So given these three constructs, can we find evidence from a number of sources? Let's start with what is strikingly referred to as the Age of Reason, European Enlightenment. I'll let you read this. This is from John Locke. And this is from Voltaire.
Can you read it loud, please? My eyes aren't.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. Yeah. John Locke says, every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, of what opinion or religion soever, irrespective of their religion or opinion. Voltaire says, so John Locke, you can see, I'll map John Locke onto the dimension called power. Now, let's see what Voltaire says with respect to the dimensions we call being and knowledge. Do I have to read this? I'll make okay, I'm going to make an effort to read. Their round eyes, their flattened nose, their lips which are always large, their differently shaped ears, the wool of their hair, that very measure of their intelligence, place prodigious differences between them and the other species of men. And they are not men, except in their stature, with the faculty of speech and thought at a degree far distant to ours. Such are the ones that I have seen and examined. And one could say that if their intelligence is not of another species than ours, then it is greatly inferior. Our philosophers of enlightenment, the age of reason. A colleague in a publication I co-edited recently of the Routledge Handbook of Language and Race, Lucy McConney, recalls her experience at the School of African and Oriental Studies of the University of London. So they were in this class where, they were doing syntax. They had to represent the language using the tree diagrams. And she speaks isiZulu, and she told her professor, I don't think I could use this tree diagram to represent my language. Okay, now let's see what happens. The professor says, look, my friend, every human language can be represented using this diagram. And see how she reacts. The statement hit her at 3 levels. First, it meant that whatever she claimed to speak was not a human language. But a corollary of that was that she was not a human being. I mean, of course, if what you speak is not a human language, then you would expect that you are not a human being. So her knowledge of her language as a native speaker was completely erased. So there's a professor, gray-haired, with a lot of power, saying, no, you can represent every human language using this diagram. So even in classroom type interactions, we see these 3 dimensions at play: power, knowledge, and being. All right, against that backdrop then, let's come closer home. We want to now look at education, the interface of language, racism in the context of education. I think one key assumption in much of the work that exists in this area is that language is a surrogate, is a proxy for racialization of power, being, and knowledge. Oh, sorry. One assumption is as stated here from John Bowie, where he makes the point that there is some assumption, there's some connection we often make between how people speak or how we perceive people to speak and their intelligence, all right? And just to make this come alive, I point you to this. So, I'm not sure, oh, you can't see that. I'm not sure what's happening. But anyway, Lippy Green talks about Disney films and the languages spoken by characters in Disney films and the we'll call them the indexicality, what the ways of speaking point to. So, surprisingly, RP, as far as the Americans are concerned, it's no good. So the villain uses RP, all right? Okay. But standard American English is reserved for the virtuous, the morally upright, and the hero, and what have you. Marconi and colleagues make this point about the social embeddedness of language. In other words, language use reflects society, okay? It reflects the structure, it reflects the social environment. They say, for instance, that grammatical patterns, and this is where I'm very interested in. Grammatical patterns, the patterns of grammar in the text we write, we need to break them down, we need to open them up, because very often they would reflect the political and the social context in which those instances of language are used. So against that backdrop, I asked the question, within education, where do we find those micro contexts where we find this interface of language and racism? It can be inside the classroom, but it can also be in the playground outside of the classroom. It can be in textbooks, and I'm going to be focusing on textbooks. So there are a number of sites within education in which one can inspect, one can find this interface of language and racism. And the actors, well, kids, lecturers, colleagues, and so on. I mean, we just saw the example of Bassey Marconi earlier on. And just to give a sense of some of the work that has been done in this area, I mean, there are different accounts, but I'll point to just 4 or 5. There's work that has been done on what's referred to as microaggressions, which sort of divide into micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidation. So micro assaults, the racial slurs, the use of derogatory language, micro insults, that's a very interesting one. So when you encounter an individual and in your mind you don't expect them to speak English that well, you say, your English is strikingly very good. It's almost as if the subtext said, how is that possible? I don't expect you. Okay? So on the surface, it's commendation, but again, please feel free to commend me at the end of my talk if you choose to. I won't read any meaning to it, okay? But sometimes such commendations, could have a racist undertones. And then with micro-invalidation. So if you ask me where I came from, I said, I come from Belfast. Yeah, I mean, originally, where do you come from? I come from Belfast. Yeah, okay. I just, even though I was born here, it's just not possible, all right? Okay, so we'll talk very briefly about microaggressions. We'll also talk about phenotypic grammar, in other words, grammar or language use that explicitly communicates racial or racist ideologies. Then we'll briefly look at teacher talk, and we'll then look at what some colleagues refer to as racial linguistics, and why they think we shouldn't be compelling minority speakers to try to appropriate the standard versions of whatever language. It's a waste of time. It's a pipe dream. You will never be accepted. So they say, you look, don't bother. All right? The listening subject will always find something faulty. All right? So you shift the emphasis from yourself as the racialized author and put the responsibility on the powerful listening subject. You take care of your bias. I am not going to try and conform to your so-called standard, because even if I checked all the boxes, you still see something to complain about. Then, drawings, images we have in school textbooks, okay? Those are also very important sites for insidious discrimination. And then finally, descriptions, exoticizing descriptions, detailed descriptions we provide in the name of attention to detail. Okay, let's quickly look at a few microaggressions. I mean, we're all familiar with this, and there's research pointing to the emotional toll, the psychological toll that this has for students and learners, and of course how it affects their engagement with the school curriculum. In many environments, students disengage as a result of the very hostile psychological environment created by the use of slurs such as this. Now, in terms of grammar, in novels that are prescribed, we find explicit forms of language that identify racialized authors with certain ways of speaking. So whether it's Conrad's Heart of Darkness or just about any other book, you find that characters who fall into the category of the racialized author, especially African characters, are associated with simplified grammar, no inflection, no tense. And I got this example from Polish, from the work of the Nobel Prize winner Sienkiewicz. All right, here you have the English translation. I'm not sure your Polish is very good on a Thursday afternoon, so I took the liberty of providing a translation in English. All right, so here is how an African character has been made to speak. Now, how often when we read these novels do we attend to that? Do we just see it as a form of mimesis or sociolinguistic? You know, people speak in different ways. Are we aware that there are racist undertones? Okay, so says, you great sir, kill Gabriel, kill lion and buffalo. Yeah, you great sir, kill still many lions. Yeah, much meat. Yeah, yeah. That's the prototype. That's how the racialized author should speak. All right? Teacher talk. They're a lot more subtle. You have learners, students who come from different backgrounds. They communicate in a different way. perhaps as a teacher you expect that there should be a strict chronology, and the student is now trying to get across, and you say, hey, listen, get to the point. Repeatedly, get to the point, get to the point. Do you know what psychological damage that is doing to the kid? The kid simply has a different way of getting to the point. But we are impatient as teachers. Say, look, get to the point. Just tell us exactly what happened. All right? Stop beating about the bush. Or this example from G, even more subtle. So it's about a neighborhood decline, and there is another neighborhood, an affluent neighborhood where everything is okay, and the teacher is addressing the students from under-resourced backgrounds, less privileged, and rather than focus on the subject matter, notice the teacher's use of pronouns. So the teacher makes the students responsible for the neighborhood decline. So rather than say, well, neighborhoods, this is what happens to neighborhoods when A, B, C, happen. But what does the teacher do? He says, you do this. When you don't do this, this is what happens. However, the other group, they take care of their area. So the learners are all of a sudden made responsible for the decline of the neighborhood. And who are these learners? Who are these kids? They belong to the racialized order. So without realizing it, the teacher's use of pronouns in describing a factual matter has the unintended effect, hopefully, of racializing the students. Let's look at the next one. So Flores and Rosa have this paradigm they call racial-linguistics paradigm. So they claim that the relationship between language and race is so intertwined that one can speak of the co-naturalization. They go together inevitably. And the argument they make here is that as the racialized minority, if you did all the TOEFL courses and all the English for whatever that's on offer, the white listening subject, the powerful listening subject, will not accept you as having achieved the level of proficiency they imagine is required. Okay? So they give this example from a previous study. There's Estella, who is a PhD candidate in Spanish studies, in Hispanic studies in the US. She doesn't speak European Spanish. She also doesn't use the standard Latin American Spanish. She's a second generation Chicana, so Mexican American. So whose Spanish is neither here nor there, as they say. Remember, she is a doctoral candidate, yet, her classmates and supervisors think there's still something wrong with her Spanish. So let me read this out. When pressed to describe what they perceive to be her limitations, Estella's professors can give few details. It's all intuitive. the fighting to find explanations. Most of the faculty agree that Estella's written work is quite competent. What else do you need? Still, there's something about her speech that strikes members of the Spanish department of faculty as not quite adequate and causes them to rank her competence even below that of Anglophones who have acquired Spanish as a second language. So the use is to make the point that the power lies with the listening subjects. To give another example, if a George Floyd, all right, says to a police officer in the US, I ain't do no drugs, right? The police officer may decide to hear, I ain't love drugs. So what Flores and Rosa are basically saying is, it's a pipe dream to think that you'll be able to speak like and be accepted by the powerful majority. Let them worry about it. You don't bother yourself. Just speak the way you need to speak. Which is not to say you shouldn't learn the grammar, of course. But the title of their paper is about undoing linguistic appropriateness, not being this obsessed about trying to model your use of language on some imaginary standard. Okay, how about iconography, the pictures, the images that we see in textbooks? They are views that have been expressed. Let me just take the second one because of time. When blacks are represented traditionally, they are represented in ways that evoke sensuality, sexuality, servitude, degradation, and primitive culture. They basically serve as a backdrop for others. So there's this exoticization of the black body. So the trope of the exotic black is rooted in a tradition of representing Africans that dates back to the Italian Renaissance. Now, there's a nice book by Kress and Van Leuven that teaches us how to read images. And going through that book and trying to apply some of the lessons from that book on the covers of these novels. It's the same novel, two different editions. A novel by the Nobel Prize winner of literature referred to, the Polish Sienkiewicz. I don't know what you see here. Is this innocent? Is this innocuous? Does anything strike you here? All right, let's look at this together. Let's look at this first image. Who is at the center and who is on the periphery, the margin? Just think about your answer. Look at the attention to detail. It appears that these two, the representation of these two highlights quite a bit of the differences that exist. But when you look at these two, you almost think they were duplicates. Who is in a leisurely, sort of casual posture? And who appears to be the backdrop, and this is some items that are carrying. Look at the others, the other cover. Again, look at the dressing. But look at the fact of sitting on such a huge animal, dominating. And look at the halo effects. And then here again, these ones are on the margin. So even innocuous images that we see in textbooks can, on analysis, reveal racial undertones. Why? The reason why I gave it, these are two different editions of the book. Why do we have this similarity? And then just before we take a break, from one of the textbooks, a history textbook I'm analyzing, we have this description. I don't know if I have to read this. Can you? Okay, thank you.
I'll be the reader for our recording. These sallow complexioned dwarf-like creatures were barely 5 feet tall. Their triangular fox-like faces, peppercorn tufts of hair, and lobeless ears were not calculated to enhance their beauty. Their noses were broad and low-rooted, and their eyes were deep-set beneath upright foreheads. When hunting was good, there was a tendency to put on weight, and the Bushmen cut a comical picture with their small feet and hands and slender limbs, carrying protruding stomachs and bulging buttocks. Their wrinkly leather skins belied their ages.
Okay, so this is the description of a First Nations group in South Africa by the author of this text. When we encounter texts like this, sometimes we get carried away by what appears to be the ethnographic attention to detail. This person is very observant and all of that. But beneath that, we claim are racist undertones. Okay? The being dimension. Okay, so there's scholarship that talks about these excessive negative physical descriptions which we find in literature. The racialized other is often reduced to an object, objectified. A source of entertainment for the Western gaze, right? Grotesque, irrational, different, in short, subhuman. All right. I would suggest we take a quick break at this point before I tell you my story. So what I've been doing thus far has been to give you some overview of what other people have done in this area of work. I think that much of what exists is depending on how you approach it. I think it's kind of overt, but I want to look at the very covert racism in the grammar of texts. Thank you very much. So, 2 minutes. Lend me your ears for another 20 or so minutes, and I promise I'll return them intact. So, when I look at some of the body of work that exists in this area, I think that there's perhaps room to ask the question, are there even more subtle ways in which racism is enacted in educational material, in the language used in educational material? So I describe the work I'm doing currently as a hidden grammar. When we hear crypto, we'll just think of what someone out there in the US is very much into. But if we apply that term, cryptotypic would mean hidden. So the question I am posing is as follows. Are there ways in which racialized ideologies, taking into account the three dimensions we started off with, power, being, and knowledge, are concealed in the textual grammar? In other words, beyond the single, the odd sentence, but in the overall grammar of the text. And the data I am working with is comprised of school textbooks that were used in two countries. One in South Africa in the apartheid era. So the apartheid era in South Africa was an era between 1948 and 1994 where, let's just call it, racism was a state policy. All right? So apartheid itself means separateness, separate existence of the races. So I'm trying to look at how racial ideologies were embedded, or how the textbooks reflected racial ideology of the period. But with a former postdoc, I'm also interested in textbooks of English used in pre-independence Ghana. And there are a number of things we're doing in this area, and we have some things in press and some others that have been published. But the case study I'm going to offer today is what I call the politics of knowing in texts. The politics of knowing in text. And the question is, what racializing acts are performed in the way the textbook, or the particular textbook I'm looking at, describes knowledge? And to give you some insight into the kinds of issues that could fall under a textual politics of knowledge, I'll give you the following poses, the following questions. So let's imagine a text is describing the origin of a group. Well, maybe there are two groups. For one, the origin is known. For the other group, the origin is not at all known. And you wonder why. Or, where the origin is known, is it known as a matter of fact? Is it presented as known, but you know, the evidence is not satisfactory? Is it a personal opinion? So whose knowledge of origin is presented in this way versus this way. Is the item on origin, knowledge item on origin, is it presented as self-evident and does not require any evidence, right? Or do I have to prove that I am from Belfast? Okay. Is the knowledge expected? Or, that's interesting, I wouldn't have thought of, I wouldn't have expected, I wouldn't have believed you came from Belfast. All right? Is the knowledge true under certain conditions, but under other conditions it's not true? So a range of questions that give you a sense of the kinds of things one could be interested in if they wanted to look at the textual politics of knowledge from the standpoint of racialization. Now, what are some of the tools I am using for this? I find SFL, Systemic Functional Linguistics, quite useful. I'll skip details of that. I said to say that this is an account of grammar that recognizes the social basis, the social conditioning of language use. It sees language as a system of choices that we make, and therefore the choices you make are not innocent, as it were. They are motivated by certain considerations. Now, evidentiality has to do with where your knowledge claims come from, you know, is it attributed, and so on and so forth. Then from Mayton has this construct he calls legitimation code theory, which has a number of dimensions. There's a semantic dimension. The dimension I work with here is called the autonomy dimension, and it's basically about where the knowledge is coming from. Is it internal or external? And it has codes. So relational autonomy, when you have a plus, it means it's strongly internal. The knowledge comes from the community. The knowledge about the group does not come from the gaze of some other person. You see the difference? So you are able to tell your story of your origin, as opposed to some other person telling the story of your origin. So in the quick example I'm going to be giving of just 2 or 3 passages, so this is a history textbook that was used in the apartheid era in South Africa. And I'm going to take about 3 passages. The first part of the book is termed World History. And it deals with the Greeks, the Romans, you know, the usual. And then when it comes to the section called South African History, it starts, of course, with the Dutch, and then subsequently to the local populations. So what I want to do is invite you to look at how knowledge is represented when it comes to the Greeks, how knowledge is presented when it comes to the Dutch, but then how knowledge is presented when it comes to the local groups who are derogatorily termed the Bushmen. Okay? They're called the San. So I'll be applying insights from these tools to try and surface what I think are racial ideologies embedded in the textual grammar, in the grammar of the text. So that's what we want to do now. I'll give you 30 seconds to go through this. I mean, this looks like, no post text. I mean, what could be wrong with this? As we go on, I have animated a few things. So you'll see bubbles or square or underlining dropping. So when you look at this text, it's very clear that the knowledge on the Greeks comes from the Greeks. There's reference to legends. There's reference to Homer, the Odyssey. So knowledge of the Greeks comes from within the community. Some of the sources of knowledge are presented as self-evident. Almost makes you feel uncomfortable. So if you don't know the well-known legend of this is, well, it's well known. Okay, all right. Of course, you should know the great blind poet Homer. If you don't, then you should be uncomfortable. And you should know that he produced one of the world's greatest epics. So, although with the blue things, you have the impression of, well, maybe this is being, the certainty is sort of being softened a bit, but it does not undermine in any way the information being presented. So in terms of our autonomy codes, you see RA plus, relational autonomy plus, everywhere. The knowledge is from the community. Okay, so let's look at what in SFL is called thematic progression. The theme, so the theme is the departure point of the clause, all right? What does the sentence start with? So we see that consistently, the theme has to do with Greece, and the rime also has to do with Greece. So it's closed. It's all about Greek, Greece, almost as a German, Griechenland. So there's hardly any external influence on the knowledge. Now let's look at the Dutch. So we're talking about the Dutch exploring the African hinterland. Again, when you look at this, I'll give you a few seconds. Perhaps nothing really strikes you. Try and ignore the XFL annotations that I have included there. It's just to help with the analysis. So this is a passage of the book that deals with African history, all right, specifically South African history. And I'm going to be suggesting that this is less about South African history and more about Dutch activity in South Africa. So the perspective for the text is exclusively Dutch. It's true that the local populations occur some 9 or 10 times in the text. Again, the Hottentot, that's a derogatory term. Harry, Savannahs, a new race, whom, who. So you can't say that the locals are not represented in this text. But this is where the grammar comes in. The question we ask ourselves is, how are they introduced into this text? Notice, so let's use traditional grammar. They are not in the subject position. It is only in one case that they're in the subject position. All right? They are typically in the object position. And in SFL, that could be the goal, phenomena, and what have you. So they need to be contacted. Something depends on their visits. Somebody suspected Harry, all right? Harry had to be found. Yeah, you see, the discovery mentality. You're discovering. That already tells you the lens, the perspective. I mean, we've been here since the beginning of time. And somebody comes and says he's discovered us. All right, so all mentions of the local population occur in an object position. The one instance where that group occurs in what you call a subject position is in a clause that negates owning anything. They own neither houses nor cattle. Is that possible? Let's look at how they are evaluated. Harry was suspected. The verb suspect is not, it's not nice to be suspected, right? They were difficult to persuade. They were a small, wild race. Of course, they owned neither houses nor cattle. So that's how the local population is represented. Now, let's see how the Dutch social actors are represented here. The first exploring party of 7 volunteers under Jan Bintervogel. So they're in the subject position. Number 1. They're experienced. Again, subject position. They penetrated. They found. Where am I?
13.
Yeah, Bintervogel discovered. Okay, so the local population is, let's use a traditional grammar term, is in the object position. Whereas the Dutch have the agency. They are in the subject position. They are the ones doing the things. And they are described in glowing terms. Experienced, while the local population are referred to as small, wild race. Okay, so let's, pretty much like the Greeks, we have a similar pattern of thematic progression where the point of departure of the sentence of the clause is, apart from that last example, is the Dutch. Okay, so we now have two accounts of the grammar of representation of European groups. Let's see how the local groups are represented. So again, the San are a First Nations people, and derogatorily referred to as Bushmen. All right, so we know very little. There's a lot of conjecture here. It must have been occupied. We can hardly determine. There must have been people living. All right? But then there's an interesting play of certainty and uncertainty. Look at here. It is definite, though, that they were at one time scattered all over Africa. So you wonder, what determines when you are very certain? I suspect it's when you want to sever the local group from the land, then that's when you're certain that you know their origin, right? Because you want to give the impression that this was a terra nullius, it was uninhabited, right? So there was nobody here, so we didn't take anybody's land. So it's important to be very certain about where they come from and their achievements. So here, conjecture, but here, a lot of certainty. So, how do we gain knowledge about the local groups? From wild animals. Okay? Not from them, but from wild animals. From ruins, magnificent ruins. Ruins all the same, however magnificent. That's how we gain knowledge about. Not from what they say they are, but from animals, wild animals, from ruins, from skulls. Right. Very important as a source of knowledge, skulls. Yes, of course. We know about them from or through the lens of the Dutch. We are not allowed to know the origins from them. That knowledge has to come from an external gaze. Even their name, come on. We had to know their name from the Dutch. Of course, they didn't have any names, right? Prior to the arrival of the Dutch. We can only know about them in relation to places that are far-flung from South Africa. To make the claim that, look, when we arrived, there was nobody. So they came from elsewhere. So we need other geolocations to be able to know them. North African tribe. Scattered all over Africa south of the Zambezi River. Northern Spain. Even their work of art, the rock paintings for which they are known, it's important not to credit them with that. There's something that's called the Hamitic hypothesis, basically saying that anything of worth that you find in Black Africa must have had the influence of the West. And that's what we see here. Whether their paintings were really created by them, well, there's some debate around that. After all, similar things have been found elsewhere in Spain, France, we can't bring ourselves to acknowledge that they have knowledge. They're capable of producing works of art. Okay, so just as I begin to conclude, what do we observe from this short analysis? Remember, we started with a construct of race that acknowledged, or that acknowledged that there were three mutually reinforcing dimensions: power, being, and knowledge. What we see from this short analysis is that those with power are able to provide knowledge about themselves on their own terms. They're also able to provide knowledge of the racialized order. But in doing so, the being of the racialized order is described in non-complementary ways. The racialized order is an object position, unable to produce anything of worth. Okay, I think I've already spoken to that. So what we then have is this vicious cycle repeating itself over and over again of this mutually reinforcing hierarchies. So there is knowledge that's been presented. That knowledge dehumanizes the racialized order, but in the process, it reinforces the power of, shall we say, the racial majority. Why does any of this matter? What I did was I took the same texts about the local population and then asked ChatGPT, here are some of the insights from this analysis. I want you to rewrite this text. Now, imagine yourself as a sand child, and you have to read this about yourself. What impact would it have on you? And compare the impact it would have on you with the impact this other version would have on you. So this one says the most primitive race. This one says an enduring and resourceful people. Very different. So basically, the text grammatical insights were fed into the LLM, and the LLM was found to produce a different version of this text that does not dehumanize the sand. And it's very different. Wouldn't you rather be a sand? I would. If I read this and I was told this was my history, I'd be devastated. Now, let's take this text Lorna kindly. Again, I had, just to give a sense, I had an LLM give me another version to more or less reverse the micro assault, to feel what it is that the sand child feels when they are described in this manner. It's not nice, right? It's terrible. Okay, so in wrapping up then, what I've tried to suggest is that racial ideology is linguistically embedded in educational texts. And in addition to the range of initiatives available, it's also important that we engage with the language of the texts in order to be able to push back against some of this. I've given some of the tools that I use, and I think these tools are extremely valuable in making racial ideology visible, in surfacing it, because as I argue, very often in the context of grammar, it can be very subtle. So here are the kinds of things I have just done in order to surface, to open up these texts. I have basically sort of asked questions related to the bullet points here. But it's not just enough to critique. With the LLM examples I gave, it's important to ask yourself, how do we push back? How do we write differently? And the reconstruction phase, this is part of the inputs I gave into the LLM to be able to come up with a different version of that text. And I think that if we were to do this, we would get to a situation where both learners and teachers can become knowledgeable agents of change. I was just reading a report, I think it's here in Ireland, indicating that while many teachers are aware of racism, but they're not quite sure how to respond, right? So hopefully approaches such as we've sketched out here should help in responding to racism in the language of educational texts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Bassey. Much appreciated, and lots for us to think and to talk about. To start those discussions now and to lead us through the many questions that we may have, I would like to invite a very dear colleague, Dr. Rebecca Loader, who has worked for many years here at Queen's University Belfast, engaging with researching educational experiences of young people going through the education system in Northern Ireland, those from an ethnic minority background and those from a range of backgrounds. And so I would very much like to invite Rebecca to join us as she to begin the discussion of our question and answer session. Thank you, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ashi, and thanks, Bassey, for such a rich and really thought-provoking talk. Obviously I had sight of it ahead of time, and I've just been thinking a lot about some of the themes that come up, and particularly the resonances with the education system in Northern Ireland. Particularly at the moment, as some of you know, we're going through a significant period of change in education, which I think is steeped in a number of kind of colonial assumptions of the type that we've heard today around cognitive science, Eurocentricity around knowledge, what constitutes knowledge, and preferred approaches to pedagogy. So one of the things there were a couple of themes I wanted to pick up from your talk in thinking about Northern Ireland, and one was really around the politics of knowing, who has power over knowledge, and the representation of the racialized other. And we heard from what you've been saying about how those with power validate narratives, uphold the existing social structures and hierarchical relationships. And this is something that we've been looking at in relation to the curriculum in Northern Ireland, who is considered an authoritative knower, how we reproduce relationships of power in what is written in the curriculum. So just a couple of examples. We looked at the current curriculum in Northern Ireland, and we see how subjects such as technology continue to characterise the relationship between the global north and the global south as one of paternalism and dependency. How through the history curriculum, black and global majority experience continues to be limited to oppression, subjugation, and resistance in relationships with white people. So again, much as you described around the history of South Africa actually being a Dutch history, the black history in the Northern Ireland curriculum is white history. And reviewing the draft of the new curriculum, we've seen similar things there. So again, history continues to be circumscribed according to a relationship with the white global north. Agency and autonomy are reduced. And thinking about the subject-object dimension, the global majority only becomes subject when they're resisting their objectification. Thinking, another thing that struck me, was particularly taken by your colleagues' quotes, Bassey McConey, and the dehumanisation and the erasure of her language because it didn't conform to Western prescription about language forms. And we can again see these relationships of power and linguistic hierarchy which uphold approved languages in Northern Ireland and marginalise those associated with the racial and cultural other. And we see that in the newcomer pupils policy, which is silent on languages other than English and Irish. And really, in some work that I've done with Sultan Turkan, we've identified that actually English is associated as a result of its position in the newcomer pupils policy and the associated funding arrangements with school, with learning, with knowledge and with progress. And other languages are an impediment, and not being able to speak English fluently becomes a deficiency, and it limits people's ability to gain knowledge. That's the assumption that we see. We can also see it in the proposed New English curriculum, which I find quite baffling in that it doesn't recognise at all how English is shaped by the other languages on this island, including the indigenous language. It doesn't explore why English is the dominant language in Ireland or other territories, why it's the global lingua franca, and also why the nature of standardised English, the kind of English which is prescribed in the curriculum, is heavily racialised and classed in the way that you discussed. So just finally, I suppose I was really taken with what you were saying about how we can call attention to these kinds of things and how we can disrupt what in Northern Ireland is this lens of normative whiteness and the standpoint that we use to look at the world, and the way that the curriculum texts and others construct the world that is going to be taught. And part of this is in Northern Ireland, this idea, and you talk, going back to the beginning of your talk when you were saying about the different forms of racism, we just don't have that racial literacy around what racism is. In the curriculum it's presented simply in the form of interpersonal acts. In the current draft curriculum, it appears once, the term racism appears once, and it's alongside sectarianism and other forms of conflict. And so as this curriculum hopefully moves forward, we get a new iteration. I mean, I'm hopeful, well, I'm not hopeful, but I would like to see that opportunities for pupils to really think about and how racial ideologies operate through social structures and cultural discourses. Because much of why we keep perpetuating these relationships of power through the education system, it's not all or mostly deliberate. It's just that we don't see what we're not shown and what we don't know. So there's just a few things to